All right, this is section 7.2 over complementary and supplementary angles. So we have talked about vertical and adjacent angles, and we're going to add two new vocab words to our chapter so far, complementary and supplementary. And so two angles are complementary angles when the sum of those angle measures is 90 degrees. Okay, so complementary angles do not have to be adjacent, which means next to, like they are here in this example. Although those two angles would add up to 90 degrees because together they form a right angle, as you can see by that little red square. They could just be two completely separate angles that happen to add to 90 degrees. So the important thing to remember here is that it's only two angles. It's not three angles or four angles that add to 90 degrees. It's just two angles that add to 90 are said to be complementary. So this example, just to give us some practice with complementary angles, says the graph represents the measures of complementary angles. Use the graph to complete the table. So if you look at the graph here, you can see that it starts up at 90 degrees up here. And if one angle is 90, the other angle would have to be 0 because, well, it has to be two angles. So that wouldn't really work. And you can see also it ends at 90 over here as well. So I'm going to fill out the chart using this graph, and then I think you'll understand once I start filling out this chart, you don't need the graph at all to see what the other angle would have to be. So it says when y is 180, or sorry, when y is 80, right here is where I'm looking, when y is 80, x has to be 10. And that makes sense because 10 and 80 degrees would both add up to 90 degrees. The next one says when x is 20, so when x is 20, y would have to be 70. And then the next one, when y is 65, so 65 would be about here, x has to be 25. And really, I don't need this graph at all. All I'm really doing is subtracting whatever one angle is from 90 degrees. You can see here they've already got the next one filled in, 30 degrees and 60 degrees. So what if I did 90 minus 45? If I do 90 minus 45, that leaves me with a 45-degree angle. So I know that those two angles will be actually the same size, but they still add up to 90 degrees. Well, what if one angle is 30 or 40 degrees? Well, then 90 minus 40 equals 50. And so I could put 50 degrees up here. And then the next one is 75. So if I had a 75-degree angle, that would leave me with 15 degrees in order to get that to 90. So then this would be 15 degrees. So really all I'm doing is subtracting what one of the angles is from 90 degrees so that together I know that they would add up to 90. Okay, so complementary angles are two angles that add to 90 degrees. Supplementary angles are two angles whose sum is 180 degrees. So again, they can be adjacent angles. They can be next to each other, like this example here, and happen to be sitting on a straight angle, which is 180 degrees. So I know angle 3 plus angle 4 would have to be 180. Or they could be separate angles that don't have to be touching each other. And if I just happen to add those two angles together, I get 180. So supplementary is 180. So the way I remember that, just alphabetically, complementary comes before supplementary in the alphabet. 90 comes before 180 numerically. All right, so let's look at a similar problem to last time when we were working with complementary angles. It says the graph represents the measures of supplementary angles. And so because they're supplementary angles, you can see the graph actually goes to 180 on both sides, the y-axis and the x-axis. It's counting by 40s, which is kind of weird, on the x-axis. So this would be 200, and so this would have to be 180 right between there. So it's still going to 180 on both of them. And so to fill out this chart, it says when x is 20, so when x is 20, go up here and hit the line, y would have to be 160. And then when y is 150, so that would be here, X would be, well, if this is 20, then I guess that would be 30, right? And so I don't really need to use the chart, just like last time. I don't use the graph to fill out the chart. I'm just going to go ahead and just subtract whatever one of the angles is from 180 degrees. And so for the next one, if I do 180 minus 60, that's going to give me 120. So I know the other angle has to be 120 degrees. The next one, 90 and 90, of course, those add to 180 degrees. So if I've got two right angles, I would have those angles would be supplementary. The next one, 180 minus 50, leaves me with 130. So the x would have to be 130 degrees. The next one, if I do 180 minus 140, that leaves me with 40 degrees. And then the next one, if y is 30 degrees, then 180 minus 30 is going to give me 150 degrees. So just to recap, all I'm doing to find the other angle is I'm subtracting the one that I have from 180 degrees, because I know together they would have to make 180. So if I add these angles together, 160 and 20 makes 180. 150 and 30 makes 180. 60 and 120 make 180. So I'm just subtracting to find out what the other angle is, just like I did up in the previous example, except I used 90 because in the last example they were complementary angles that add to 90 instead of 180. All right, so in this next example, it says, tell whether the angles are complementary, supplementary, or neither. So we know complementary means that together those two angles will add to 90 degrees. Supplementary means together they'll add to 180 degrees. And then if they add to something that's not 90 degrees or not 180 degrees, then we would say neither. And so we have some questions like this on our homework, and I want to make sure we show our work on our work paper. So this is what you would do. You would start by adding the two angles together and see what you get. It's pretty simple, right? So 70 plus 110. And so 70 plus 110 gives you 180. So we would say these two angles are supplementary, and I'm okay if you abbreviate that SUPP, sup. Example B, we add them together, 128 plus 62. Don't forget, you can use your calculator on this to help you, see what you get. I know that 8 and 2 are going to give me 10. And I'm going to carry that 1 to add it with the 2 and the 6. That's going to give me 190 degrees. So these two angles aren't complementary. They don't add to 90. They're not supplementary. They don't add to 180. They would be neither. They just add to some other number, right? So they'd be neither. Example C, it looks like these are forming a right angle. Let's check to make sure that's what's going on here, because if they do form a right angle, I know they would be complementary. But let's show my work just in case. 41 plus 49, the two 40s make 80, and 1 and 9 makes 10. So they do equal 90 degrees, so this is complementary, and I'm okay if you want to abbreviate that comp, right? Even on your work papers or on your quizzes or tests, I'm okay if you want to abbreviate that. And then example D, it looks like these two angles are forming a straight angle, which would measure 180 degrees. Let's check to see if that's true. 44 plus 136. The 6 and the 4 are going to make a 10. I'm going to carry that 1 to make 7 plus 1's 8. So if I add these together, I will get 180 degrees. So they are supplementary. And so if you compare these two angles with the angles that we had up here in example A, they both add to 180. Example A, those two angles weren't touching each other, but if they were, you would see they would form a straight angle right there. In example D, these two angles we would say are adjacent because they're touching, right? They're sharing that side, and they also form a straight angle. So of course they're going to add to 180 degrees. And then example E, we've got two angles that, again, aren't adjacent. Let's see what they would add to. 70 plus 19 is going to be equal to 89. So they're almost complementary, but not quite, right? So I'm going to put neither. It has to be exactly 90 for them to be complementary, and it has to be exactly 180 for them to be supplementary. And then example F is the next one here, 26 plus 64. Let's see what we get here when we add them together. The 6 and 4 makes 10, carry the 1, and that's going to give us, that's going to give us 90 exactly. So this is going to be complementary, or we can abbreviate that comp. So that's what you're going to do in your homework. You're just going to write those numbers down. We're just going to add them together to see if we get 90 degrees complementary, or to see if we get 180 degrees supplementary, or if we get something else, we just put neither. All right, so now I want to go over some, I guess this is a good way to review our vocab. It says complete each sentence with always, sometimes, or never. And the first one says, if X and Y are complementary, which again, that means they'd have to add to 90. So if X and Y add to 90 degrees, then both X and Y are always, sometimes, or never acute. Well, acute angles are angles that are less than 90. So if I've got two angles that add to 90, together they would have to be less. Even if one was 89 degrees and the other one was 1, they're both technically still acute angles. So if I've got two angles that add to 90, they would always be acute angles. Example B, if X and Y are supplementary, that means they add to 180 degrees. Then X is always, sometimes, or never acute. Well, angle X could be acute. For example, angle X could be 30, and I could add it with 150 to get 80. So angle X could be acute. Angle X could also be a right angle, though, because 90 plus 90 equals 180. Or maybe X is the obtuse angle. 170 plus 10 equals 180. So angle X could be really whatever. It could be acute, it could be right, it could be obtuse. So I'm going to say sometimes here. Not every time, but yeah, it could be an acute angle. Example C, if X and Y are complementary, that means, again, they add to 90. Then X and Y are always, sometimes, or never adjacent. Well, again, adjacent means that they are next to each other. So if they add to 90, they would form a right angle. So angle 1 and angle 2 would be adjacent to one another. So yes, they could be. However, we looked at examples on when we did the previous problems where they don't have to be. I could have an angle that's 30 degrees, and then I could have an angle that's 60 degrees, and they don't have to be touching, because that's what adjacent means. They share that side. They don't have to be touching to be complementary. So this is going to be sometimes. They could be touching. They don't have to be touching. And then the last one here, example D, if X and Y are supplementary angles, which means they add to 180, then X and Y are always, sometimes, or never vertical. All right, so this uses a definition that we did last section, vertical. Vertical angles are the angles you get when you have two intersecting lines, right? So this angle here and this angle here would be vertical, and the other two obtuse angles would be vertical. So I would say 99% of the time, if two angles are supplementary, they would not be vertical. Because in order to be supplementary, I'd have to be talking about this angle and this angle, angle 1 and angle 2, because together they sit on a straight line. Angle 3 and angle 2 would not add to 180, and angle 1 and angle 4 would not add to 180. So 99% of the time, I would say that's not true. However, there is 1% of the time when I have two lines that are intersecting perpendicularly. And so I could have a right angle and a right angle and a right angle and a right angle, and this would be the only time that two angles could be vertical and also supplementary. So if angle 1 and angle 3 would be vertical angles, and also because they're both 90, add to 180. So even though that doesn't happen very often, I still would have to say sometimes and not always or never. Okay, so in your homework, you're going to have a few of these questions yourself. Let's look at some of them. Number 3 says, tell whether, again, it's always, sometimes, or never true. And it says, if x and y are supplementary, which means they add to 180, then x is obtuse. Well, I already mentioned this up here. Actually, I believe it was up here in this example. We said that x could be the acute angle, x could be a right angle, or x could be an obtuse angle. So I'm going to answer this one with sometimes. This would be sometimes true, because it could be obtuse. All right, number 4 says x and y are right angles, then x and y are supplementary. Well, remember, right angles are 90 degrees. So if x is 90 degrees and y is 90 degrees, they would have to always add to 180. And that's what supplementary angles are, is two angles that add to 180 degrees. So this would be always true. If they're both right angles, they will always add to 180 degrees. And then number 5 says if x and y are complementary angles, so they add to 90 degrees, then y is a right angle. Well, if they add to 90 degrees, we actually answered this question previously before. We said they both have to be acute, right? If y is a 90-degree angle, that would mean that x would be a 0-degree angle. If y is a right angle, y is 90 degrees, then x would have to be 0 degrees, and that means it's not an angle at all, right? The 0-degree angle it's just not an angle. So this is going to be never true. If x and y are complementary, then they'd have to both be at acute angles to add up to 90. One of them couldn't be 90 already. The other one would have to be 0 and therefore not exist.